Okay, ladies and gentlemen, when we're looking at section 7.6 in Math 1033, one of the first things we're trying to get across here is that the largest set of numbers that exists, that the only set of numbers that exists is not the set of reals. There is a set of numbers that come up, and those are referred to as the imaginary or complex numbers. And by definition, I is the square root of -1. Now, the square root of -1 is obviously not a real number, because what times what gives you -1? There is not a real number that does. But by definition, I is the square root of -1. Now again, the actual use of complex numbers comes up in much higher level math. At this point in 1033, we are just attempting to introduce you to the fact that when you have a square root and a negative underneath, you will end up with I as the answer. It is not a real number. It's called an imaginary number. So if I ask you to write the following in terms of I, the square root of -25. Basically, the way you work this problem, the negative underneath the radical is going to let you know that there's an I in the answer. And then you just kind of do it like you did it in the past. What would the square root of 25 have been? Well, it would have become 5. So our answer here, instead of just 5, is 5i. Again, not a real number. How about the square root of -17? Well, when you have a square root with a negative underneath, you're going to get I in your answer. And what's the square root of 17? Well, there's nothing more you can do with the square root of 17 because there's no perfect squares that come out of it. There are two ways to write your answer. Square root of 17, I. And a lot of times you'll see I put in front of the radical. They're both correct. Sometimes I like my students to write it this way that I'm circling rather than this way, because sometimes when students write it this way, when they put the I, it's hard to tell whether they meant it to be under the radical or not, and it's not supposed to be. When I is written this way in front of the radical, it's very clear about its placement.